everyone, and welcome to this session of LitFest X. We are joined by Deepa Prahalad from the United States this morning. Deepa is a business strategist specializing in opportunities of the intersection of consumer experience, technology, and strategy. She has a wide range of experience in multiple industries and has worked as a management consultant with several firms, from startups to large multinationals. She is very passionate about emerging markets and innovation. She began her career researching how to improve efficiency in the United Nations procurement team and later moved to Singapore to become a commodities trader with Cargill. She holds a BA in political science and economics from the University of Michigan and an MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. Deepa, welcome to LitFest X.
Thank you so much for having me, and apologies for the delay.
No, no worries. So, Deepa, we've got an interesting topic with you today, design for entrepreneurs. And, you have a very successful book which came out a few years ago on design thinking. And you've done a lot of work on how design and innovation work hand in hand to solve sort of problems. Um, you know, when we are talking about design for entrepreneurs, how do you define it and why is it important for entrepreneurs?
Well, I think one of the things to really remember is that the meaning of design has really undergone a significant change. I think in the last 20 years, the traditional understanding has really been focused on aesthetics and packaging and those kinds of things. But I think as an entrepreneur, it's really important to understand that design is really a series of experiences that consumers have with your products and services. It's the process through which they bond with you as a company, and become and stay as consumers. And also, if we really look today, all of today's business challenges, you can't really separate out the process of design from innovation itself. All of the big challenges that we're dealing with, co-creation, consumer experience, sustainability, new business model creation, all of them require us to do something very different. It requires us to use new materials, new ways of doing business, new ways of communicating. So if you want to be an entrepreneur, you can call it whatever you want. You will have to be a designer. There's really no option. And I think that there's some really huge advantages to doing so. Even very good aesthetics can be quickly copied. You look at something as sophisticated as Apple, and in 2 years, Samsung can reproduce aesthetics. The way we form relationships is really critical. Those are less easy to copy and replicate.
You mentioned something very interesting, in terms of design being at the core of even innovation or new business design. Why is it that entrepreneurs or businesses many times just stop at aesthetics, and don't move on to the innovation or, to the problem solving aspect of design?
Well, I mean, I think that's just been a limitation when you are an entrepreneur and resources are scarce. I think people are very focused on making sure what they have works. You get very caught up with distribution, advertising, all these kinds of things. But design is a very central role today. And doing it right, I think some of the companies like Apple and Google have made the importance of this practice more readily understood by people. But I think for an entrepreneur, there and even large companies, there are really three critical skills and things that design can do for you. One is the way that you design actually can transform your market size. It's not like the old days where we could look at incomes, look at the number of population, demographic data, and say, this is my market size. I think what's been seen in industries like cellular phones is that once you add functionality and once you design things in a specific way that's actually inspiring to people, the market size that you projected may be very much larger than you initially thought. So you see that nobody who was designing and looked at cell phones in the 80s when they were big and clunky, and some of these old movies you see, I don't think making those more affordable would have changed much. But today, the design of the cell phone has taken something that used to be a want and has transformed it almost into a need as a part of belonging to modern society. So enlarging the market is one. The other thing is, even if you want to create social impact, even the best ideas don't really have impact in a vacuum. I think if you look at even somebody like Gandhi, he didn't really originate the idea of Indian independence, but the creation of rituals, the communication of a narrative about how this goal would be achieved and why, and outlining the steps made a huge difference. And those are all what we would today consider aspects of design. And the third is that information alone doesn't really get you as far along as you would. I think the IT revolution has made it possible for a lot of people to have access to information about trends, about new opportunities, to create the kind of moonshot statements. So now the test is really, how do you execute on it? How well did you deliver on those goals? And if you look at the macro level, you see that even very much pure play strategy consulting companies are understanding this. They can't really trade on information alone. They're acquiring design firms to bring this skill within their doors.
Give us some of the fundamentals that entrepreneurs should keep in mind when thinking about or approaching design. I mean, you've done a lot of design consulting with leading multinationals. So give us some of those fundamentals that you have used.
I think the most important thing to remember as an entrepreneur or even as a big company is that there isn't one right answer. People connect to a variety of things. Emotions are the heart of the connection that you build with your consumers. It's just that we may all like, even in terms of food preferences, one day we might like to try a trendy restaurant, but that doesn't really mean that the next day we're not going to enjoy a home cooked meal with the same degree of enthusiasm. So we have to really look at what's true to the brand's history. What are the values you're trying to communicate? And I think what's really important is making sure that whatever product or service you put out matches the values that you have, the goals you have for the company, and feels authentic to people inside the company. Because if you can't pass that test, it's very difficult to communicate with a larger audience. So really spending time understanding people, but not necessarily only in terms of their income, but truly in terms of their aspirations. What are their pain points? As an entrepreneur, I think you have to realize that, for better or worse, business kind of is the fairy godmother of the modern age. You can actually help people get a step closer to their goals with how you design things and validate the consumer. I don't think that design is really only, of course, it's a show of the capabilities of the firm, but you can't forget that really successful companies always validate the consumer and make them feel good about themselves.
You know, there's been a lot of narrative and sort of pushing of the Make in India initiative, and rightfully so. But clearly, Make in India will not be successful unless we really, think of design thinking from the ground up. When we are investing in those companies, when those companies are being formed, when those products are being envisaged. How do you think design thinking can help this Make in India initiative?
Well, I think design is really about behavior change. It's about creating aspirations. And for countries, I mean, if you look at a wider range of experiences than just India's, I think for countries, I really think of design as two metaphors. We look at what a country produces kind of as a signal for both their capabilities and their intentions. And I think that's really important. And if you look at all of the countries that have really made rapid gains economically in the last 30 years, mainly from East Asia, it hasn't really been that somebody went and they discovered oil. It's all been through this process of communicating with the outside world, trading, building brands, building connections. So, as a strategic signal, it's very important to say, yes, I am capable of innovation. I think India's IT industry really changed the perception of the country. So, you need to have these industries that are willing to compete globally, that are able to stand on the world stage in order to get the respect as a country. So I would call that design as a strategic signal. And I think a lot of companies today in India are doing that. The second is really, I think, especially in countries like India, but now gaining traction everywhere, is design as a tool of social justice. Not only are we able to create wealth for companies, but are we able to deliver a better life to the citizens of different countries? And I think it's important for everyone to remember that development and behavior change are all really central. Design is something that can feed all of those objectives. And those are not things that we necessarily need to do in order to attract investment from someone else. I think if you look at the history of the United States, people came to this country not because they were looking at economic growth numbers, they weren't available anyway. They came here because of the lives they believed they could have and the lives that Americans themselves were enjoying. And I think in a country like India, really changing life on the ground, changing the interactions that people have, and delivering a better degree of living are the things that the Make in India movement can help promote.
Deepa, when you mentioned changing life on the ground, also then it leads me to my next question around design thinking for the BOP, bottom of the pyramid. I mean, clearly your father, late Professor Prahalad, was the pioneer of the idea of the bottom of the pyramid and how one can view them as great customers, and also, like you mentioned, what about social justice and bringing about equality? And so do you think there are certain design principles which can really very directly be applied to create products and services for the bottom of the pyramid market?
Yes, I think there's probably a few distinctive factors in these markets, and I think one is really that affordability isn't enough. I think the first round of innovation for these markets, they really focused on the small sachets and single servings, and just making sure that people had access to basic goods and services. But that's not really enough. I think you really have to now look far more carefully at aspirations, and I think where there might be a significant difference in how you compete in these markets vis-a-vis the West is, I see that when you're really dealing with consumers who are quite affluent and have a lot of different products and services and are spoiled for choice, we tend to try to create a problem and exaggerate the need for the problem. And if you've ever watched an infomercial, some of these pretty minor irritations are blown up and exploded to demonstrate a need for the product in almost a ridiculous fashion. But in the bottom of the pyramid, you really are designing for very complex problems and sometimes, survival needs, basic needs. But that can't be the way you market the product. You have to market it in a very aspirational fashion, as if this was something that anybody would want. You can't really unintentionally shame your consumer. You have to really look at it and make this seem like a journey that they're looking forward to taking, not that they are being shamed into. So that's one. And I think one of the other mistakes that I think probably India has been the best at dealing with is that this is a group of consumers that is evolving the fastest, changing the fastest, but traditionally that hasn't been where the most exciting lineup of products is being offered. It's the slower stuff, the things that have, once it's in, we keep the same thing on the shelves for 5 years and then say, oh, well, profitability is declining. Well, yeah, because people have moved on. They're looking for something new. And also sometimes observation is deceiving. You have to go a second level down. Sometimes I think having an open heart is more important than having just open eyes, because there's often a hidden logic to behaviors. One of the design firms locally that went to Brazil said, we can't really understand why people in the slums are spending such a high percentage of their disposable income on cable TV. And as they interviewed people, they learned that many of these people felt their neighborhoods were very dangerous. And they were using cable TV as a way to keep their children at home and keep them safe. So they weren't actually paying for TV. They were kind of using the television as a proxy for security, in which case you have a very different view about what the solution is. So delving 10 steps further down to understand the hidden logic is really central in this market.
So when you mentioned hidden logic, clearly um time and again, we've seen that certain products have demonstrated that the actual consumption or the use is very different from what producers or marketeers intended the product to be. And do you see those as flaws in the design, or maybe a wider acceptance of a product design?
I actually don't see it as flaws. I think this is a very important source of learning for companies that are and entrepreneurs who are able to embrace it. Because I mean, the customer is always right is one of those things that you have to follow unless they're doing something that is harmful or dangerous either to themselves or to the company. I mean, I think the classic examples from India that we all know of people using the washing machine to make lassi. Okay, let's help people out. Let's give them the attachments that allow them to do those kinds of things, because that's where your consumer is telling you they find value. And in even in places like this country, I think Lego, for example, found people who learned how to program mindstorms and do very different things than what they intended. And the company realized, well, we're no longer in control. At the same time, do you want to punish your most passionate users, or do you work with them and say, okay, what do you want to see? And I think that any company today, they need to use design as a way to form a connection, but that conversation can't be a one-time thing that ends at the point of purchase. It's something that really continues, especially as pressure to innovate faster and faster, and competition comes in more quickly. You need to have that conversation on a very frequent basis about how people's needs are evolving to help you understand where to go next.
You know, we've obviously seen, in many companies, whether startups or even large multinationals, that the return on investment for, on items, on line items like design or R&D, is always under question. And can you give us some examples of where you've seen good design has really given phenomenal return on investment, if you will, or boosted financial performance?
Yes, I think there have been systematic studies today that are trying to capture this. And I think that what we're starting to understand is really that design is not where the strategic risk is. You can have a great idea, but if it's not delivered in a fashion that really people adopt quickly enough, that's where you run into problems. So I would encourage people to really look at design as a strategic insurance, as a way of making sure that people are able to boost your returns, that you're able to realize that. And that comes from packaging and offering things in a way that people connect with. But in the US, they actually have studied the S&P returns of companies that are seen to be design driven. They looked at a consortium of about 15 companies, and they have found that that investment in design allowed this group of companies to outperform the S&P by 224%,
Wow.
between the periods of 2003 to 2013. And a large percentage of that was from the success of Apple. But even removing them, it still is about 58% overperformance with regard to the S&P. And when I say design, it's not necessarily activities that an entrepreneur wouldn't be able to do. These were things like deeply understanding the consumer, doing a lot of ethnography, studying the behavior, talking with people about their needs. So these are accessible things that technology is making faster, cheaper, easier for a wide range of people to do. And if you really look also at surveys, whether it's Interbrand or any of the others, the brand value assessed is always somewhat subjective. And those caveats are easy to understand. But what you really see is that brand value can fluctuate wildly, even in the period of a year. And so you're seeing a lot of value either be gained or lost. And if you look at the number of product introductions these very large companies are doing, it's not a huge number. So that tells you that really getting this right um, offers huge benefits, and therefore it's something that really should be taken seriously.
There's also been a lot of companies that have clearly used design to build their brand image of being a product or being a company which has exemplary design. The obvious one being Apple, but have you seen again consistent brand building efforts by other companies just because of good design?
Yeah, I think that what you really have to understand as an entrepreneur is that it's not necessarily about snazzy materials. Those things will capture attention, but sustained business success depends on more than that. Products and services are kind of like people. They become more or less attractive over time based on your interaction with them. And what people really respond to is, does the promise fit my actual experience? It's not necessarily, there are brands in all categories, all price points that really delight their consumers, that engender great brand loyalty. If you look even in something like airlines, which are, we have budget airlines that have the same loyalty as, business class on Singapore Airlines or those kind of things. So there isn't a specific price point, there isn't a specific aesthetic. But what all great brands do is they make people feel good about themselves when they use it. And that's important. How do you create that transformation? And I think whether you're dealing with people who are very poor at the bottom of the pyramid or very rich, people don't want to be judged by what they spend. They want to feel good spending whatever they possibly can. And that's why customer service and all these other pieces beyond the aesthetics are so important. What you really need to do is back this up with an actual experience that the consumer has. And I think that they're able to then connect with the story. I think when you're an entrepreneur, you have to go through all the business plan and all the financials and all these things to understand your path to the market. But you do have to be able to turn that lens and understand that for the consumer, they don't necessarily see or know or care about those things. But if they connect with what you are offering, then they do become interested in, what were your motivations? How did you come up with this idea? How was it made? And they continue that connection with the company. And they also can really help you call out mistakes. If they have a connection with something you've done, if they feel they understand your intentions, nobody can get innovation right 100% of the time. So I think that emotional connection really matters almost sometimes when you have mistakes, because just like a good friend, your consumers can help you say, you know what, you need to fix this, or look, I fixed it for you. And that's the kind of connection that really big companies like Apple have.
Very interestingly, you mentioned about the connect with the consumers, and it's not always just about the physical elements of the product. It's the overall experience. If entrepreneurs who, like you discussed earlier, they have 10 other things to look into, and they might not always be able to give design the due importance and focus at the outset of the journey. But in terms of some broad areas, how can entrepreneurs, increase the acceptance of their brand philosophy or their product promise, to customers and even to, let's say, venture capitalists?
Well, I think, the bar for funding has changed significantly. I remember when I was raising money for a healthcare startup, when I was part of the team, the bar for funding was, do you have a revenue model in mind? Those are the kind of questions. But today, the questions are much more about usability, adoption, who's interested in this, who is going to be engaged, what's your plan for getting people to care about your company. So I think the communication aspect is something that really is important, even from the very beginning. But again, different CEOs, different entrepreneurs have very different personalities. So I think the narrative around what you're trying to create and why it's important is a very critical piece. And that doesn't mean that you have to delve into personal details, whatever. I think people, from a consumer perspective, really care about a few things. They need to kind of understand, now, how is this going to make my life better? Or if not directly my life, maybe in the case of social innovation, how is this going to make the world a better place? And we have to be able to show and tell on that aspect. The second thing that is, what inspired you on your journey? And I think very different people, in India, we have companies like Infosys, the Tatas, and people have a sense of what they're about, what they stood for, because you've all grown up hearing stories about times when tough decisions were made. And I think all great companies share those stories internally and externally. And I think the other thing that's really critical that consumers need to understand is, does my voice matter? Whether it's a good or bad experience, are you welcoming my ideas? So, like you said, entrepreneurs especially are dealing with many different things. But I think the issue is if you share, and not necessarily, I'm not saying share your patent drawings, but if you share what the broad goals are, what you're trying to accomplish, people can help you. People who are not necessarily on your team can see something that maybe you don't, and they're willing to help you along with that. And I think if you don't give people a chance to co-create and have a voice in the development phase, the only thing that they're left to have a voice on is complaining about what it is when you're done. So you never want to create that situation where, I'm not able to give feedback into how to improve, then I'm going to tell you only when I'm unhappy. And that's a very difficult position to be in when you do have to innovate many times and go through many iterations, no matter what the product or service is.
Right. Deepa, we've been getting some questions for you over Twitter. We'll probably take one or two quickly as we are just about to end the session. So I'm going to show you the question and you can then respond to it.
Absolutely.
So the first question is, what's so beautiful, rewarding, and inspiring about design? Is it the secret recipe for success?
I would say it's the only secret. I think it is critical because what really happens is everybody is talking on making information available. But designers and entrepreneurs are responsible for doing more than that. You have to translate trends. I think, the example that I frequently talk about is, you can look at many how the family has evolved around the world today. You often see both husband and wife are working. You see that there are men who are in charge of their kids sometimes. You see people who have adopted children, a co parenting culture, in the West, gay marriages, all of those things. And everybody can see it. It doesn't take any special talent. But design is not about understanding the trends, it's about helping people cope with the change and the implications of those trends. So understanding immediately 10 levels below, you know what, maybe I need to put a diaper change in the men's bathroom. That's the non-obvious implication of all of those things. So design is important in terms of creating a better solution, and they're often very counterintuitive. Sometimes people say, oh my god, if you looked at poor people, the prevailing view in the aid community was, wow, you really need better food, sanitation, health. All of those things are true, they still are, but nobody understood that maybe the way to tackling needs was to respond to aspirations. Nobody said, yes, you really need a cell phone, but you know what? Now I have the opportunity to give people information on education. I have an ability to give people banking. I've given people identity. I've given people privacy. I've given people who may never have had a family picture a chance to have a family photo. But the traditional view of needs doesn't always explain what people actually adopt and what they respond to. So, therefore, I think there is a little bit of that magic that design and only design can provide.
Great. Well, lovely chatting with you, Deepa. I know it's very late at night for you in the US, and thank you so much for doing this session with our viewers. Um,
Thank you for having me.
right. If you have any parting words about LitFest X, about the initiative for our viewers, that'd be lovely.
It's absolutely wonderful. I'm so excited to be part of this event, and I've been looking at the videos and look forward to seeing many more of them. I'm just really proud to be a part of it and wish you all the best with this.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepa. And we look forward to seeing your next book out very soon. I know you've done very well with your first one, and perhaps you can keep sharing some of your great ideas and stories with us.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye bye.